Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. Grix, a booktuber at Grix, etc., put out a video talking about the Muse and invited all viewers to give a response, either in video or in comment, I suppose, with their own experiences with inspiration. And I should add that his video is initially a response to a video posted by booktuber Steve Donahue, and then Steve Donahue posted another video in response to that done by Grix. Mine is just going to be responding to Grix. I cannot unsee what I saw in Steve's videos, so I may here and there inadvertently touch on something that Steve mentioned. My experience with inspiration has been very different, possibly even somewhat unusual. And so I would like to give Grix something to go on, just another story, if you will. I don't believe that any of us has the last word, but it was kind of serendipitous that Grix's video came up at about this time when it did, because it all of a sudden made me realize that it has been 50 years now that I have had a relationship with the Muse. And when I am saying that, I am talking about the writing of poetry, the poetic muse, if you will. And this is the whole topic of the video. I've brought out some of my own books, possibly for reference if I need them. I'm not quite sure what I will need. But I remembered that back in 2009, I had written a collection of essays, and I was trying to learn how to write prose, which has never come easy to me. And I did a collection of a good number of essays. What is there? Okay, it looks like 30 or so essays. And I ended up calling it hack work. There's my copyright. And the essays dealt with any number of different topics, and then towards the end I decided to do one talking about my poetic origins, and I called it From My Poetic Origins. And I'd just like to read you some of that. Since I have it handy, some of the things that it calls up I had forgotten, and I may skip little bits here and there that aren't relevant. And I will not read the whole piece because it goes on to talk more about my poetic journey, and I only want to talk about that initial experience. So, from my poetic origins. Sometime during the fall, even the late fall of 1973, Mr. Wardlow gave an assignment to his 6th grade English class. He displayed a black and white photograph of what appeared to be a ship's deck during a storm, as I recall. There may even have been a figure dressed in what I took to be the yellow rain gear with which I was familiar as a child who had to wear it to school during inclement weather, and he told us to write a poem about it. This begs the question of whether we were studying poetry or what was the lesson, but I have no recollection of that interjection. I think we probably were. He was trying to teach us something about poetry. 6th grade is a little too early to be studying literature, as I recall, but there may have been some kind of introduction to children's verse that he was championing. I had, to my recollection, no encounter with the great writers of English verse until in high school. If there had been some prototypical poems presented to the class merely to give us ideas of how to fashion a poem, or even more explicitly to copy, I cannot say, but it does not seem so. I really would have no idea, but maybe I had some ideas then. Some class time was perhaps allotted for the assignment, but it would not be due until the next day. That evening, I recall sitting at the plywood board in my bedroom, which I used sometimes as a desk, when the inspiration came over me and I wrote a poem. Immediately, I knew that something fantastic had happened, though I couldn't say what or why. I had had for me what would be a life-altering experience, though why such a thing should have happened during a routine homework assignment, and I was never an enthusiastic scholar, I might never know. Here is the poem. I will skip the poem. Then I talk about some problems with the composition. A new art form had opened up to me, and as I would say, a new relationship to the inspirational muses that was to have tremendous significance upon the permutations and vagaries of my subsequent life, though at the time I did not know enough to call myself a poet, or to even see beyond the experience with a more comprehensive analysis, other than that I realized something amazing had happened to me, almost as if I had been subject to a life-changing transformation, which, as I say, it was. Excuse me. That was a bit redundant there, I think, going on and on about the transformation. I was just delivered some nice goodies, but let me continue. Something must have impressed me because I asked my mother to save my scratch copy of the poem for me. I knew she was capable of retaining something like that, whereas I, as a little boy, was not, and to my happy surprise, she did. It was found among her possessions after her death in 2001, and I keep it in my scrapbook now. But that is not all. The next day, Mr. Wardlow collected the assignments, his eye scanning the papers as he received them. Unknown to others, but I was observant, after he scanned mine, he announced to the class, "Maybe some of these will get printed in the school newsletter." He had us read our poems to the class, and I remember when it was my turn standing before my classmates that I felt pride because I knew I had done something special. My awareness of the superiority of what I had written would alter the relationship I would have with my peers, not in a good way. I'm in a new location, and so my allergies seem to be bothering me a little bit. Excuse me for a second. Furthermore, I skipped a little bit here. Furthermore, having written the poem changed my relationship to myself. That night, I imagine, I went home and, without a homework assignment, tried to duplicate the experience. I wrote another poem, this time without the inspiration of the muses, and it fell flat. I understood that what had happened previously was not of my own initiation, that it was not mine to call forth the writing of a poem, but that, as with prophecy, the words had come and had to come as though from outside of myself, or they would be worth nothing. The poem that I had crafted without inspiration seemed dishonest and would later be destroyed. I knew then that one's relationship with the Muses must be a sacred thing. Of course, I would not have had the vocabulary to describe any of this at the time. Sacred, Muses, prophecy were all words and concepts with which I had no familiarity then, but I understood honesty and dishonesty. So I would have been 11. And as I say, it was sort of fortuitous or serendipitous that I saw the video by Grix, because it jarred the realization in me that it has now been 50 years since I have had a relationship with my muse. My even saying the Muses, that was for the purpose of this essay. Now, I would probably be more inclined to just say the Muse. It would be many years before the Muse would visit me again. And then it goes on into talking about some of my early forays into writing. So if I was 11 then, I did not pick up the pen in earnest until age 16, it must have been, in high school, when I was introduced to a poem by Emily Dickinson. So that was what set me on the path. So here is the thing that it was printed in, the Happy Hickory, 1974. It was printed in March, and for some reason my mother wrote Dave's poem is in here, something like that, and then for some reason wrote 1974 and then circled 1974. I don't know why she would do that, but I was glad she heeded my behest and saved it. And more than that, somewhere here, there is the poem itself, Forgotten and Forlorn. I didn't know that you were not supposed to capitalize the and it says scratch copy, and more than that, scratch copy down there. So it has been 50 years. This was not published until March, so it was written, I would guess, in October or November. I seemed to think late autumn, so probably right around this time, 50 years ago. And it was promptly forgotten about. Of course, when the newsletter came out in March, I had classmates who remembered and protested to the teacher. You said that maybe some of the poems would be printed. They were aware that mine was the only one that was printed. So that's a little bit of history. And so I have to do some extemporaneous talking about the relationship with the Muse, and I'm not quite sure where to begin. It's not something I've ever talked about. It's never been something I've talked about when I've been amongst other writers of poetry. There was never any need. We all have our own sources of inspiration. I think, to begin with, particularly in the field of poetry, it should be noted that, especially in the Western tradition, poets have always spoken of inspiration. That poem that I titled Forgotten and Forlorn, and it ended with the word forlorn, that was not a word that I'm sure I even knew. Possibly, you will say I had heard it somewhere and my subconscious picked it up. I mean, if you want to aim for some kind of psychological explanation for that, be my guest. I am not in a position where I feel any need to convince anybody, to convert anybody to my way of thinking. You can make of it what you will. It was an experience that happened to an 11-year-old boy out of the blue. And then as years progressed, I began to establish a firmer relationship with the Muse. Now, what do we mean when we say the Muse? I don't know exactly. Tradition has it that we say the Muse, excuse me. And I'm fine with that. We have a lot of words that are inherent in the English language, such as God, and we use these words without thinking about them. Perhaps they are an abstraction. When we say God, most of us do not mean the bearded figure that Michelangelo painted. And so when I say the Muse, I don't mean, say, some blonde-haired woman wearing a red dress, if you will. I don't mean that at all. I mean some force beyond myself. Now, I wrote that it felt like the work that I had done without the inspiration felt dishonest. And I think I experimented with that at least on one other occasion. But the idea of it being a sacred relationship remains. And I think possibly one of the reasons that some people don't care to acknowledge the Muse or the possible relationship with a force outside of ourselves. It may just be a thing inhering in the English language or inhering in language itself. There's no way to know. But one reason that some people don't is that they perhaps chase their Muse away. I think Grix gave a very good example of a period of, I think, about 6 months, he said, when he was writing 8, 9 poems a day and just going like that. And I don't doubt that at all. That indeed is how the Muse can work. Now, he said he didn't want to keep doing that. He didn't like what it was doing to him, and so he put the kibosh on that. Now, everybody's situation is different. He may have shut the door on his Muse with that. That's not to say that he can't write. And I am not an authority, and I would not also be surprised if, because he said that he did it because he felt he needed to read and study more. And the Muse may look kindly upon that and come back to him. As my Muse came back to me, it was a long period. I started playing around with words in earnest at age 16 and was pretty dedicated solidly until either at age 29 or 30, I achieved my mature writing style, which you could say would be I achieved my relationship with the Muse. I understood the Muse better. The idea that when you receive something from the Muse, you are just transcribing it is not actually the case. You do have a little bit of wiggle room for a word here or there, but by and large, that notion is the best description we have of what it is like to receive something from the Muse. That also doesn't mean that you are absolved from any sort of work on your own. I am friends on Facebook with a sculptor, and he spends time every day drawing figures. He likes drawing naked women, and so he just will give himself a couple of hours and draw from memory, trying to get everything anatomically correct. That would not, strictly speaking, be considered art, perhaps. But what that is something that enables him then, when the inspiration comes, he is equipped for it. It's the same with any art. I studied Tai Chi for a while, and I studied with Master Liao in Oak Park, and he said that there were two types of students. One type really understands the concept of Qi and everything about what you're doing, but they can't do it. And the other kind just somehow has a natural talent, a natural ability, and they can do it. But then when it comes to understanding it, they don't have that piece together. And so it's very rare to get both of them together. And as you're working toward that, you have to do practice, you do exercise, you do forms. Real Tai Chi, you don't have to just do upward and downward or whatever the Cheng Man Ching short form. You just follow the energy as it moves you. But you can't get there just like that. And I would say it is probably the same with most any art or with poetry. Now, poetry is a little bit different in a sense because words fail us, as T.S. Eliot famously said. The words are imprecise and cannot capture what is going on. And I have always seen poetry as more an offshoot, a very minor offshoot of prophecy. It's not an idea that I came up with on my own. That was something that Spencer said. And I think he was right. He felt that poetry exists prior to the arts. As I say, we have a whole history of poets talking about inspiration. So I will show you one of my books. This is the first book of poems that I put together. I was nearing 30 or was 30 and had very little to show for myself. With dedication to the Muse over all those years. The Muse is not necessarily just going to be generous with you without your having proven some kind of reliability to her. And again, I use the word her figuratively. Sometimes you may get tested, as with any sort of a courtship. It happens. But I wanted, there's a poem in here. Let's see. This book, so when I reached the age 29 or 30, I felt I had to compile a book. I had to. And I scoured all of my notebooks, everything I had written. And in a couple of cases, I tried to update them or revise them. And I came up with a small book. But really the initiative was, so I have page numbers here apparently. The poems run to page 60, I think. And at page 48 was when I sunk into my mature style, and I have not deviated from that style since. But it was another momentous occasion on the road to getting to know my muse and getting the muse to trust me well enough. I can say this now. At the time, I could not have said that as well. But so there was an earlier poem, and there are some from the very earliest days, like maybe one of the like 8th or 9th poems I wrote, and I destroyed most of my early stuff, and even I think most of those early notebooks, I just got rid of them. But there was one, let's see, I'm having a hard time finding this. No, it has to be before. No, that was too early. Oh, yeah. You know, it's been unseasonably warm in Chicago. We don't really have seasons in the old way anymore. This was a poem that touched upon the turning of the seasons. It was written in September, I think. I could be wrong on that. You have wiggle room when you write. And just let me read you the last stanza. How will we know the signs that foretell love's evanescence? Evident, no less than the turn we all feel, the dead leaf found in our tenement. Now, I wanted to bring up 2 points about that. Number one was the word tenement. I was not living in New York in a tenement. So that was an untruth in a way. The fact was that I was living in a slum apartment. It was in a very nice neighborhood, but there would be no other way to describe that building than as a slum building. So the word tenement works. It suits the experience without being dishonest. But the other part in that last line that reflected a choice, the type of choice that you as a writer have to make, the dead leaf found in our tenement. The truth of the experience was that it was not a dead leaf, it was a dead fly. You know, at the end of the season, the end of summer, the weather starts turning and you start seeing dead insects all over the place. The thing was, truth to the experience in that case would not have been truth to the reality, the poetic reality of, say, the audience. Poetry has certain tropes, and if you stray too far afield, the thing with the muse is not doing it for you. The muse does nothing for your sake. The muse has her own purposes, and that's the thing that's, I suppose, hard to understand in some of this. So when the muse gives you something, you don't know exactly what it is, but you have to try to figure out what it is that will appease what the muse is demanding. And so in this case, it was absolutely what she wanted. If I had said the dead fly, that would be thinking about myself. And so this touches only in the shallowest way of the idea that when you receive inspiration, it is not at all, not in the least, about what you want to write. you don't have a choice in the matter, and it goes much deeper than that. I can give you a second little tidbit on that. In 1998, I wrote my big poem, the Requiem. There it is. It's a big poem. And I'm sorry that I destroy parts of my notebooks. I write in a notebook, and the whole first, 18 pages of the notebook or something were me trying to have my own way and write something different. And then I finally decided to give in to the Muse, and I did. And then this came out, and it was indeed just a matter of writing it down. I mean, I had to be able to handle it physically. This was the first time I had ever done something like that. And so it's a learning curve, and you have to learn things like how to have simple foods prepared and that sort of thing, because you have to listen to the Muse, and you can't put it off. And so I had to have something that was around that I could get. Now, as I have become older, the relationship with the Muse has gotten different. And there is, at this point, if the Muse comes back to me, but how it's been for the last, say, 20 years, no need at all to feel like, oh, I've got to write this today. No, if I write to where I can handle and then stop, and then I can just pick it up. But that is because I have an established rapport with the Muse. But I sadly tore out those first 18 pages or whatever they were because I was embarrassed by them. And then 5 years later, in 2003, I wrote my second big poem, the Resurgia. The title is unfortunate, but if the poem does stick somewhere, they can always change that, as often happens. And this actually was the poem that I had been trying to write in those first 18 pages. I just was not able to do it. And wholly unexpected to me, the Muse came back 5 years later and gave it to me. It was a kind of gift, if you will. And so I was happy to have that. Now you can come up with all sorts of reasons for that. I can't say what it is. And the other thing you really need to know about dealing with the Muse, there's that old biblical story about, is it Isaiah? The Lord tells him to go and slaughter his son, Isaac. Or was it Isaac? I can't remember. Wilfred Owen has a marvelous poem about that, but he would not, and instead sowed half the seed of Europe one by one. Well, that is the kind of obedience that the Muse demands of you as the writer. Nothing less than that. I would assume that the biblical story is something of a metaphor for some kind of spiritual meaning. But the Muse will make demands upon you and see what you do with those demands. And if you refuse them, that's it. She probably will leave you. The Keats poem, "Fame like a wayward girl will still be coy." The Muse is even more coy than a wayward girl, and fickle. And if you do the wrong thing, if you somehow dishonor the Muse, she will leave you. And that, even though I have a relationship of 50 years with the Muse, I am yet as subject to it. Now I've reached a stage where I hopefully am retired. I did videos about my last book, the last real book. I mean, I could do some compilation, my book of sonnets, which I believe is the last, because my first real book after that assortment that I put together was a book of sonnets. And so I believe that the symmetry of that, or the bookending of my years of writing with similar books. I have a video on it. You can go look it up. I believe that was the Muse's signal to me, to tell me that that was it. My obligation was relinquished, or I was released, if you will. I don't say that I would dispute a visitation from the Muse if it came, but I think, as I say, my obligation at this point is done. Excuse me again. Now so I was going to say that you really don't have any choice in what you write, even in terms of subject matter. I mean, if the Muse tells you you have to write Palestinians should die, okay, and that's the poem, and you have to have lines all along that. Perhaps you get squeamish and you don't want to write that. Well, right there, you have said no to the Muse. So you don't know in that case. You might get all of those lines, and then all of a sudden at the end, there may be something that turns it around. I mean, you don't know what the Muse is going to do. The Muse may give you lines which are perceptibly bad, just really lousy stuff, and you have to put that down. I mean, you have to just listen to that. I mean, you as the conduit for this, it's not your business at all to say whether something is good or bad. It's not your role, and you just have to concede and adhere to what the Muse demands. You know, another obvious example would be if the Muse gives you, say, poems like done by Robert Service. The Muse wants you to be Robert Service. Well, you don't want to be Robert Service. People in poetry, the academics and whatnot, kind of look down on that sort of writing. You don't want that kind. You want to be more like Shakespeare. Well, right there, you've again revoked your charter or whatever. You've revoked the relationship. It is not on you at all. So from the standpoint of the poet and his relation to the Muse, there is no difference. You take what you are given. The other thing is you have no say in the quantity. I think it was W.H. Auden that mentioned the poem Western Wind, a very old lyric. Western wind, when will thou blow? The small rain down can rain, or shall rain. Christ, if my love were in my arms, and I in my bed again. And he said, if you write 4 lines like that, you've done it. You've hit the jackpot. And that is absolutely the truth also. I mean, and you may get that and never get anything else. And that is common. The writing of poetry, as I say, has much less to do with us and with our ambitions and desires than something outside of ourselves, which we cannot quite name or understand. I have one friend who said that it seems like frequently a poet doesn't appear, but at a certain time, a handful of poets will appear, say 3 poets, so you'll have Keats and Byron and Wordsworth and Shelley and a whole group of people kind of around the same time. And that's probably the case. There's probably some ferment in the air. And then it just is a question of which one grabs what. And so you as the poet, you can't covet that. And if you see something there, you take it. Contrary to what Steve was saying in his video, that having a relationship with the Muse makes you unable to write, and that becomes an excuse. If you have a solid relationship with the Muse, then you will be writing. I mean, most likely. You can't, as I say, guess for sure. I mean, I may just be one of the lucky ones. I mean, I've written 2 big poems, which in my day, that was something that people really strove for. And I have a good number of, excuse me a second. There she goes. I just didn't want her to knock the camera down. Well, I wrote plays as well, and I have at least 20 plays that I wrote. And my books would have to number that, particularly if you count something of 50 pages as a book. I mean, booktubers, Shorty September will count this as a book. That's fine. That's one book. So I'm sure I've got that many books. And it may just be a stroke of luck, but it may be that I was particularly favored. And that, again, is not to say anything about the quality. It's not for the poets. It's not for the poet to judge that. So if I were going to talk and say something specifically to Grix, I would say to trust your own instincts and do what feels right to you, especially if you're talking about writing poetry. The thing is, as a writer of poetry, you have to be in a state where it doesn't matter if the poem you write is the one that becomes anthologized in 50 years or not. It really makes no difference. Or even, and I have only come to realize this late in life, it doesn't even matter if you are the unsung Emily Dickinson, whose work was never retrieved from oblivion. I'm sure there were other hands putting poems on paper that have disappeared. That, again, is not for you to be concerned with. For a long time, I was worried about trying to publish. I mean, I have put these books out. You can see what I looked like back then. It's quite shocking, isn't it, in a way? But now I've realized it doesn't matter. And honestly, as I say, I'm not a teacher. As you go your way as a writer, you find that and now I'm not talking to Grix, I'm speaking generally. As you go your way as a writer, you find that there are people all over the place that are trying to capitalize on your desire and trying to sell you services. And particularly writing is something that you most likely do not need anybody to teach you. I took a writing class with Paul Carroll, and it was a magnificent experience. So I would never dissuade a person from taking a class. But I don't think I learned anything about writing from him. He was a good man, and he was extremely knowledgeable about poetry. And so he was exactly the figure that I needed in my life at that time. And then, of course, I met people in the class. And so we had a small literary community, and that was also important. But as far as learning something from a person who tells you that they have the answer, I would be very leery about that. I know in the world of theater, you have a lot of playwright classes taught by people who haven't really had any kind of lasting success with their plays. So you just have to kind of trust. And as I say, the Muse may well not favor you. After 50 years now, it's my 50th anniversary of relations with the Muse, and so it's a special moment for me. Honestly, I would not have done this reflection had I not seen that video by Grix. And I suppose if anybody wants to ask any questions about it, feel free to make a comment or even make a response video if you like. I don't think anybody really will, because honestly, I think that the experience of encountering the Muse is not all that common. I think everybody has the facility for creativity in them, but it may not be the one that you want. I think of the Three Investigators story of the guy who was a masterful forger, and he forged paintings. And it turns out, as a painter, he wasn't all that good, but he crafted these beautiful frames, because when he wanted to sell one of his forgeries, he had to have the frame look like it was. And he was a master at making these frames. And that is really how life tends to work. The thing that you want may not be what is wanted for you. And so I suppose you have to be receptive to some degree. I mean, I did not come from a literary background, and I was just an 11-year-old boy responding to a class assignment when that thing overwhelmed me. So I will leave my talk there. As I say, I am not arguing with anybody about anything. You really don't have to accept what I say. I'm just relaying my experience. So this has never been published. I have 3 works of prose. I've never been all that comfortable with prose, and now that I've given up writing effectively, unless something changes, I'm not even concerned with trying to get that stuff into print in any kind of way. I think I have one that's up on the website that is the last thing of my attempts at literary criticism. Not anywhere in the league with T.S. Eliot, if you will, just pretty pathetic stuff. So let me leave it there. Thank you, Grix, for broaching such an interesting topic, at exactly the opportune moment for me. It really got me thinking. I mean, I wrote something about that in 2009, but it's not something I really think about. And so this called back up these old memories. The little souvenirs that my mother had set aside are down in the basement, and I had to dig those out. So it's kind of a trip down memory lane, and it's really been wonderful for me. So thank you very much for stopping by my channel.